Welcome to my YouTube channel, Dickens & Company. This is the first in a series of vlogs that I'll be making about my ongoing research into the life, works and times of Charles Dickens. Much of the material that I intend to post will be new, appearing here before I commit it to print in either articles or books. Essentially, there will be three strands to the talks: bibliography, biography and more broadly literary criticism. Very often, however, these strands will overlap, sometimes in quite surprising ways. For this talk, my starting point is going to be what's almost a footnote in Dickens's bibliography, with the aim of demonstrating that if you ask the right questions and come up with the right answers, then bibliography doesn't have to be as dull as the proverbial ditch water. My first question to you, and one which I expect you all to be able to answer, is: what was Dickens's personal favourite amongst his own books? That's right, David Copperfield, his first-person Bildungsroman, serialised in 20 parts in 1849-50 and published in book form with illustrations by Phiz in 1850. Next question. How do we know that it was Dickens's favourite book? Sorry, what was that? Because he said so. Possibly. Because he wrote so. More likely and more permanent. And now for my third question. If Dickens did indeed write that Copperfield was his favourite book, where did he do so? Well, we know that Dickens only produced autobiographical fragments, but where else might he have written about his own writings? I can hear some of you sub-vocalising prefaces and will immediately award 10 points for the correct answer. Let's take a look at the Cambridge Bibliography of English Literature and its 92-column entry on Dickens to see what it has to say about prefaces to David Copperfield. Here we are, 1858 cheap edition with new preface. That seems to be what we're looking for. And, as if by magic, here is a copy of the very rare 1858 cheap edition, which was, incidentally, just the second edition published in Britain after the first of 1850. It has a newly produced frontispiece by Phiz, showing David and little Emily on the seashore, opposite the title page dated 1858 and naming the publishers as Bradbury and Evans. Then, after the dedication to Mr. and Mrs. Richard Watson, at whose country mansion Dickens wrote part of the manuscript, here's the preface. Trust me when I tell you that the first 4 paragraphs make no mention of this being the author's favourite book, while the 5th and final paragraph reads as follows. The foregoing remarks are what I originally wrote under the head of Preface to the Personal History of David Copperfield. I have nothing to add to them at this time, June 1858. Now this is very odd. First, this is not a new preface. So the Cambridge Bibliography, shock horror, is wrong. And while it would be characteristic of Samuel Beckett, for example, to have nothing to say, it was most unlike Charles Dickens to be at a loss for words. And there was a clear precedent for the production of new prefaces, as all the previous 10 volumes in the series contain new introductory material by Dickens, like this 6-page preface to Pickwick, or the celebrated preface to Oliver Twist. So, what's going on? Why has the Cambridge Bibliography slipped up? And where does Dickens make his remarks about his predilection for this novel? Let's look again at the very little that he does say. I have nothing to add to the foregoing remarks at this time, June 1858. There's the clue. But what was so unusual about that very time in Dickens's life. Story time. Dickens first met Nelly Ternan at the beginning of August 1857, when they started rehearsing together in London ahead of 3 performances of The Frozen Deep and Uncle John in the Manchester Free Trade Hall later that month. Dickens was 45. Nelly was 18, the same age as his daughter Katie, but the celebrated author was smitten, infatuated, or in love with the young, vivacious actress. After a triumphant theatrical success in Manchester, he returned to London, but soon found a pretext for travelling back up north with Wilkie Collins to see Nelly performing in a play in Doncaster. He courted her assiduously, and tongues began to wag. Catherine became aware that her husband's affections now lay elsewhere, and Dickens signalled that their conjugal relations were at an end when he had the communicating doorway between their rooms bricked up. In May 1858, the rumours that were swirling around London clubland got back to Dickens himself, and he determined to put an end to salacious gossip by making an unprecedented, public, personal statement. This appeared in the Times on June the 12th, 1858, and simultaneously in Dickens's weekly miscellany, Household Words. This statement occupies the entire front page of Dickens's journal, so the author clearly wanted to address the widest possible readership. Several of his friends had advised him against making any such statement, but Dickens's pride was wounded, and he felt that his public image, epitomising bonhomie and happy homes, was under threat. The gist of Dickens's message is that a domestic trouble of long standing and of a sacredly private nature, that is, involving himself and his wife, has now been resolved and should simply be forgotten. However, and here Dickens seems to start frothing at the mouth, by some means arising out of wickedness or out of folly or out of inconceivable wild chance or out of all three, this trouble has been made the occasion of misrepresentations most grossly false, most monstrous and most cruel, involving not only me, but innocent persons dear to my heart, and innocent persons of whom I have no knowledge, if, indeed, they have any existence, and so widely spread that I doubt if one reader in 1,000 will peruse these lines, by whom some touch of the breath of these slanders will not have passed like an unwholesome air. Dickens greatly overestimated the reach of the 1858 Bush Telegraph, and thousands of readers from Aberdeen to Adelaide, from Boston to Bombay, confronted with this torrent of bombast, found themselves for the first time wondering if Charles Dickens was having an extramarital affair. If they were then tempted to air these speculations, the author effectively invoked the wrath of God in cautioning against such treachery, ending with these words: "I most solemnly declare then, and I do this both in my own name and in my wife's name, that all the lately whispered rumours touching the trouble at which I have glanced are abominably false, and that whosoever repeats one of them after this denial will lie as wilfully and as foully as it is possible for any false witness to lie before heaven and earth." In the middle of this disclaimer, Dickens addressed his brethren, who in the present context can be understood as fellow editors, requesting them to lend their aid to the dissemination of my present words. He thus invited other journals to freely reproduce this statement, and indeed expected them to. Many newspapers and magazines duly reproduced the text, and so the whole world was alerted to Dickens's strenuous assertion that he was not being unfaithful to his wife. Dickens's appearance started to change quite dramatically around this time, but it has not been noted that his nose grew considerably longer. One journal, however, did not reproduce the author's personal statement: the best-selling weekly humorous journal, Punch, edited by Dickens's close friend and fellow actor, Mark Lemon. He found the remarks to be in bad taste and not at all appropriate in the pages of Punch. In this stance, Lemon was supported by the journal's publisher, Frederick Evans of Bradbury and Evans. But to complicate matters, Bradbury and Evans were also the publishers of Household Words, and had been Dickens's book publishers for the previous 13 years. When Dickens discovered that Lemon and Evans had conspired not to reprint his statement, Dickens's fury knew no bounds. He severed his relations with Mark Lemon and determined to make a complete break with his publishers. The strength and persistence of Dickens's anger can be judged from the fact that even 2 years later, he refused to attend the wedding of his firstborn son Charlie to Frederick Evans's daughter Bessie on the grounds that he would have been obliged to shake the publisher's hand. To recap, in mid-June 1858, Dickens was in a highly unusual emotional state and apoplectic with rage at what he perceived to be the perfidy of his publisher. But at precisely that moment, what was the writing task waiting for him in his in tray? The composition of a new preface to David Copperfield for publication by the expletive-deleted firm of Bradbury and Evans. How could Dickens get his own back? Swiftly. By pointedly not writing a new preface. That would show them. And so the words, "I have nothing to add at this time," should be understood as not being addressed to the reading public in general, but as a deliberate snub to Frederick Evans. So, now that we know why there was no new preface to the 1858 cheap edition, we're still left wondering where it was that Dickens informed readers that this was his favourite book. The next edition was the library edition of 1859, which reproduces verbatim the text of the preface to the cheap edition, as does the illustrated library edition of 1862. After that came the People's edition of 1866, but this contains no preface whatsoever. Which leaves only the Charles Dickens edition of 1867, the final edition over which Dickens had any authorial control before his death in 1870. If we leaf through the preliminary pages of this edition, we find a new portrait of the author engraved from a photograph by Watkins, the title page, and a promising looking, but undated, preface. The Cambridge Bibliography would have us believe that this is a revised preface, but it is not. It is a completely new preface written by Dickens after he had had to reread his complete works in order to write new running heads for all the titles in the Charles Dickens edition, published not by the odious Bradbury and Evans, but by the publishers of Pickwick, to whom he returned, Chapman and Hall. Thus the author's comments reflect his views from towards the end of his writing career, in the gap between Our Mutual Friend and his final unfinished novel, Edwin Drood. In this new preface to his most personal of novels, Dickens takes the reader into his confidence, revealing aspects of the creative process and his feelings about the products of his imagination. He writes, "It would concern the reader little, perhaps, to know how sorrowfully the pen is laid down at the close of a 2 years' imaginative task, or how an author feels as if he were dismissing some portion of himself into the shadowy world, when a crowd of the creatures of his brain are going from him forever. Yet I had nothing else to tell, unless, indeed, I were to confess, which might be of less moment still, that no one can ever believe this narrative in the reading more than I believed it in the writing." So true are these avowals at the present day that I can now only take the reader into one confidence more. Of all my books, I like this the best. It will easily be believed that I am a fond parent to every child of my fancy, and that no one can ever love that family as dearly as I love them. But, like many fond parents, I have in my heart of hearts a favourite child, and his name is David Copperfield. Whether I shall turn out to be the hero of my own life, or whether that station will be held by anybody else, these pages must show. To begin my life with the beginning of my life, I record that I was born